Been a long time coming, hitting stop signs. Cross-faded till I'm cross-eyed. Lost my sense of who I...
Okay, so we're gonna start by talking about like our personal identities being an Asian American. So for context for me, my parents immigrated here in their 30s, like literally knowing no English. We had like a few family members here and, you know, really just in search for a better life. And growing up, I would say that there was like a small Korean community where I was at, but largely my public school was Hispanic and white kids. So I would say that like getting teased being Asian, whether that was like kids just like, you know, pinching their eyes or like making noises like ching chong or whatever, that was very normal for me. And I just kind of learned to roll it off my back. It just didn't even register for me as a kid that like this was about like our race, I would say. And like eventually it kind of manifested into like embarrassment. For example, I would take lunches to school and it would have kimchi or like other like Korean foods, and like the kids around me would be like, oh, your food smells so bad, like, and would make fun of me for it. And I would end up just like buying lunch at school, right? But my parents were very, you know, intentional about like me maintaining like my Korean identity. So like obviously they spoke like very little English. So like in the household, we only spoke Korean. And the church I went to was like largely like a Korean church. So I think I pretty much held pretty steadfast to my Korean upbringing. And I would say that as an adult, that's very much the truth today as well.
So opposite of Jenny, I was actually born here, and you know, at a young age of 3, I moved to Korea and I started attending international school. And the next time I found myself in the US was in college, and since then I've been here. I definitely identified as American and not Korean, and that was a big part of my international school experience. Was there because you have so many different cultures. You are just literally what you say you are. So you could be like me, Asian American, but if you say that you're American, like that's all there is to it. Same goes for other cultures and races. It's just literally like what I say I am, like I am. One of my first, I guess, culture shocks of coming back was I had a lot of white friends my freshman year of college, and someone came up to me and he was like, how do you have so many white friends like if you're Asian? Until then, like I hadn't seen race. And a part of it could be because like I was the majority in Korea where I looked Korean, so I wasn't discriminated against, but also like I went to international school, so I was American. So I kind of had the best of both worlds without realizing that that was my experience. And I almost wanted to repel the Asian that got stuck in front of my American because I had never seen myself in that lens before. And I think it took some time for me to really understand and embrace that like I am Asian American, I am AAPI, and it doesn't make me any less American, but there is a distinction here. And yeah, it's been pretty interesting kind of molding the two worlds together for me.
So obviously during the pandemic, there has been a rise of like xenophobia. And I would say that during the pandemic, I would consider myself lucky that I had not experienced like a lot of instances, nor have my parents. But there was this one time I was walking at Golden Gate Park. I live in San Francisco. And just like minding my own business. And then all of a sudden, this like older white couple passes me and like literally yells like go back from where you're from, like you're not wanted here, like go back to China, etc., etc. And it almost like transported me back to like when I was a kid, and like kids just saying harmful stuff, but like they don't even know that they're saying that because they're also a kid.
I feel like it's realizing that you're Asian American and race is something you have to think about in your daily life. So like I personally haven't experienced xenophobia and racism like in the COVID world, and I consider myself like on the more fortunate and lucky side. You know, different things can contribute to that, where it's like I work from home, I work at Disney, like there's some sort of privilege there too that could be limiting the racism I might encounter. But I think to Jenny's point, back in January of last year, before COVID was like a thing in the US. I personally wanted to wear a mask because my parents were in Korea, so I knew what the COVID situation was like, and I knew that, you know, wearing your K94, like N95 mask helps keep you safe. But I think I realized very fully then, like, ooh, like I'm Asian, so like if I wear a mask, like are people going to like try to avoid me or look at me weird or like think I came from China and I have COVID? Like now that masks have become a more well-accepted thing, like I feel comfortable like wearing one and walking around, but I definitely didn't feel safe doing that until it became more of a mandate. I learned something interesting that you can also find online if you're curious, and it's that Asian Americans are not considered their own statistic like on a poll. So you might have like white people, Hispanic people, Black people, but we are often in the other category because we're not statistically deemed significant enough to have our own stat. It was very interesting to hear that because I actually did not know that at all. It speaks to a lot of things implicitly. Like if you're not considered statistically significant enough to be heard, then you will not be given a voice. And I think this speaks a lot to the invisibility aspect that a lot of AAPI folks feel, and also to the history of erasure, you know, where what you're experiencing is not centered in conversations around race and social justice. And it's almost like Asian Americans are always kind of told to like be quiet and like nothing is happening, but there's a lot of things happening. And it's just like when you hear something like that, it validates your feelings because you're like, oh, I feel invisible because I am invisible, like I'm not a statistic. So it was definitely a very interesting fact that triggered a lot of thoughts. And you know, how can we remove this invisibility that Asian Americans feel about their experience?
So Amy mentioned that like this whole invisibility erasure idea, if we're not a statistic, we're not given a voice, and it's very much like external things. But I would also say, like from a perspective of an immigrant, it internally manifests as well. And what I mean by that is I mentioned that my parents immigrated here like in their 30s, and I think a lot of immigrant kids can relate where like typically their mindset is like just put your head down, like work hard, and just like don't make any big moves. Just don't draw a lot of attention to yourself. And I think like for Asians in particular, immigrants, the reason why Asian parents emphasize success so much is because like they think that's how they will be significant in this white world. And like success is another way that like you can like have a voice, like have a seat at the table and be recognized. But it's kind of ironic because like you go through life like that, but then you're also conditioned to just like keep your head down and like work hard. And that causes a large majority of us to not speak up. As I got older, I started to realize that like how my parents' mindset or the immigrant mindset manifests into me as an adult.
There are stereotypes that you are fighting against, like regardless of who you might be. And as Asian American women, I think the stereotypes that we are kind of constantly fighting against is this idea that like Asian American women tend to be more submissive or more docile and less confrontational and less aggressive. I don't know if you experience the same thing, Jenny, but this is kind of the stereotypes that pop up in my mind right now.
Yeah, for sure. And also like calling out that like Asian American women and men have, you know, different stereotypes, but regardless, I feel like it's always like a thing that's in the back of my head, like, okay, I'm meeting this new person, or like I'm in this new situation at work, and I find myself feeling very frustrated that like I don't want anyone to like think of me in this way before I even had a chance to like present myself. In previous jobs, I would like get feedback like, hey, you should like speak up more like in meetings. And I'm like, I am speaking up. Like I am like raising my voice. And I feel like even when I tried to do more of that, it wasn't really recognized. And I knew that like I was the only one of the very few Asians, mostly white, dominated place at that time. And like you feel it, you know, like there is a stereotype working against you, and it's frustrating. And I think like constantly trying to fight against that while also remaining true to yourself has been a bit of a battle, I would say.
This idea where as an Asian American woman, you know, I am more easygoing and less opinionated. Like, things like that aren't ever stated directly to me, but I'm very conscientious of not wanting to come off that way, because a recent feedback I've gotten actually is that I'm very strong-willed. And when I heard that, I really liked it, because, you know, to come off that way, like, I feel like you have to fight against a lot of stereotypes that are like inbred very unconsciously. And so for me, like, I noticed that sometimes, like, when there are administrative tasks, like, they're assigned to me, and I try to be mindful of, like, you know, who's on my team and why I might be getting those, but sometimes it doesn't rub me the best way, because I'm wondering, like, am I getting that because I'm young and I'm Asian, and I might come off like more submissive in a way where I'm okay doing tasks like that are more supporting someone else, because I also want to support myself and my career. And while I want to be helpful in my job, I think that I don't always want to be the go-to person for those things. And so that's something that I've recently spoken up about a lot. And, you know, that's when I got the feedback that I'm also very strong-willed. And I was like, well, yeah, like, that's something I'm okay hearing.
And I think to add on to that, there's like layers that play here, right? There's like the stereotypes of like being Asian American, but there's also another layer where like just being a woman in general. And like Amy hit on something I think we should be talked about more, is as a woman, and as especially an Asian American woman, there's this like pressure to like, you always need to be helpful. And like, how can I be supportive? But I'm like, I don't want to always be like the supporting person, and like, nor should I feel pressure to play that role. And I think like there's also this facet of like, you're always like on the sidelines, behind the curtains, and like kind of doing things in the back end. And I think like that's where like the rise of like Asian representation, like in movies and like all of that stuff, has been really great, because it shows that like, oh, an Asian person can actually be like the main character for once. Okay, there's this one other stereotype that I wanted to mention. Asian women are pretty fetishized, I would say. And there's this whole thing like yellow fever, like it's very real. And I've talked about it a lot with like, you know, couple girlfriends who are also like Asian American women, and we've like, I remember talking about like, when we're like dating people that are like not Asian, we kind of always put that, it's just in the back of our minds, that like, oh, does this person have yellow fever, or like, do they really like me for me? And I think like a reason why this is so bothersome is that like, you just feel objectified. And like, as a woman in general, you're already objectified enough, like in the media and etc. But just like an Asian woman. And at the end of the day, like, women or not, Asian or not, like, you just want to be seen for you.
So thanks for watching. This was our personal take on what it's like to be Asian American women in the world. But obviously it doesn't encompass everybody's experience, so we just wanted to be mindful of that too. And to wrap this video up, we wanted to share ways on how to be a better ally.
And a super simple way to start is just to not avoid the conversation. Like, ask your Asian friends, like, how are you doing? Have you experienced xenophobia? And also, like, how are your parents and grandparents doing during this time?
Another thing we want to call out is that, you know, really recognize your unconscious bias and what stereotypes might be playing in very inadvertently with the way that you interact with AAPI folks, like in your personal life or, you know, at work. Be aware of it so we don't fall into that trap.
So all that to say, like, this is an ongoing discussion, and we would love to hear what you have to say, so let us know in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.